one of my podcasts, I talked about Pan-Africanism and how the Negro should stay away from it because we are two different stocks or two different breeds. Same stock, different breeds. Just like dogs. All dogs come from the wolf, but obviously a poodle is very different from a pit bull, even though genetically they come from the same stock. Over time, you have factors in play that change their physical form, and that's how you get a poodle and a pit bull from a wolf. And the same goes for humans, and in this case, I speak of the African. The African and the Negro are two different kinds of animals of the same stock. They're basically like a pit bull and a poodle. Not to say that the Africans are poodles and the Negro is the pit bull as if we are dominant in that sense, but we are dominant as Negroes compared to the African, but it just goes to show how uniquely different we are. The African doesn't resist against white supremacy. And the irony of history is that it took one of the greatest white supremacist nations to save Africa, that being Nazi Germany. Now, this is going to be kind of a short podcast because history is pretty simple. It's somewhat mainstream. You got to kind of do the research a little bit. But during World War II, or after World War II, before World War II, the British and the French controlled most of Africa, colonies. We all know this. After World War II, the British and French could not hold on to their colonies, and they had to let them go. They couldn't afford to keep them. Why? During World War II, the Germans, the Nazis, gave such a beating. Well, to the French, obviously, they lost. But to the British, primarily, they gave such a beating to the British in that war. And they gave the beating to the British in the war in France, in Greece, in Scandinavia, and in North Africa. And only the intervention of the United States in North Africa saved the British, to an extent. The British did have more resources there, but again, the British had to exhaust a lot of men and a lot of money to fight and eventually defeat the Nazis. And because of that exhaustion, they could no longer hold on to their colonies in Africa. They couldn't. But it wasn't because the Africans were fighting the British. It's because the British were exhausted from fighting the Nazis. The British were so tired, so exhausted of war, that any future war would have been very hard for them to take on, especially because of the atrocities of the Second World War. So there was a time where the British Empire and control the Middle East, and things got out of hand with the Muslims. They take a couple of Muslims, take the bullets, dip it in pig's blood, and shoot them. That way, they go to hell because their blood has been tainted with pig's blood. And, Muslims don't eat swine. So that was the British way of terrorizing and making sure that they knew their place. When the African got out of hand, the British would send in some machine guns and do their thing. The Africans will get right back in line. But that rarely happened, where the Africans would spontaneously start resisting. Some did resist, but overall they didn't. The British kept business as usual. But when the Germans, this great white power, And I don't say that in a glorious way. I say that in a logical way. I mean, you really did have two white powers fighting at the time. You had the Anglo white power, i.e., Britain and America, with Russia as a kind of a battering ram, and then you had the other white power, the Germanic Aryan power, i.e., Germany. A showdown between two great white powers. Who will dominate the world? Who will be the premium white power? Would it be the Anglo establishment or the Germanic establishment? That was the deciding kind of philosophical level of World War II in Europe. Obviously, the Anglo-American white power won out. I'm not going to get into the reasons why, but they won. But the Germans gave them a drumming. The Germans gave them a fight so bad that the British could no longer hold on to their economy. Even though they won the war, their economy was in shatters. Their military was in shatters. They could no longer field the military units to go to India and hold down India and the Middle East and Africa. So it made possible in the mid-50s and 60s for all these African nations that were part of the British Empire and the French Empire and the Belgiums. These were countries that Belgium and France lost. They lost to the Germans. They were totally wiped out. They couldn't hold on to it. The Americans weren't going to help them hold on to their African empires. So they had to let it go. And one by one, you see the British withdrawing from their colonies and these colonies getting independence. They got independence not because the Africans resisted white supremacy. They got resistance because these white nations were exhausted after fighting a war against another white nation who, whether or not they realized it, indirectly liberated Africa. That's a great irony of World War II. Hitler liberated Africa from the British and the French and the Belgians. He liberated it. Without Hitler, Africa would still be under domination. They are in many ways today, but I mean direct imperialist domination. You know, they would have been. But because of Hitler, they had their freedom. But you'll never hear that. It's not something that is, because of the perception of history and history being written by the victors, that is something you never hear. But it's the truth. Because of Hitler, whether he wanted to or not, I mean, he hated the African just as much as he hated everybody who was non-Aryan. So it's not as if he had a fondness for Africans. He hated Africans, you know? I mean, I only say that just because of how he felt about the Negro in America. Whether or not he really hated Africans in Africa, you know, I mean, he speaks about the French using African troops and how disrespectful that is. And he speaks about the Africans in the Rhineland that were French troops occupying the Rhineland and how they would rape German women and so on and so forth. So obviously he didn't have a very positive, I guess, view of the African. And honestly, that was the French fault. I mean, the French let those Africans run wild. I mean, to kind of put the Germans in their place, so to speak, after the First World War. So obviously his views on the Africans will not be that positive, obviously. But nevertheless, because of the way he fought that war so hard against the British and the French and eventually the Americans, although the Americans didn't suffer economically as bad or militarily as bad as the British and the French did, especially the French, they couldn't hold on to those empires. They couldn't hold on to those colonies. And they had to let them go. And they did. But because of the Germans, because of the Nazis, not because of the African. The African did nothing. Absolutely nothing. They had almost 100 years to do something. What, you think that in 1960, all of a sudden, spontaneously, these Africans started rising up? Took that long? They didn't have any more weapons in 1960 than they had in 1860. But we're supposed to believe that the Africans, or 1900s, we're supposed to believe that the Africans somehow resisted white supremacy and that these independent nations, and they'll talk all day about their independence from the Europeans. They only got their independence because of the Nazis. So instead of thanking their ancestors for resisting, they should be thanking the Nazis for fighting the British and the French. And not only fighting them, but fighting them so harshly that after the war, they had no choice because they were so bankrupt that they couldn't economically hold on to those empires. So that any resistance that the Africans did muster up would have been magnified, not because the resistance was so strong, but because they were so weak. The British and French were so weak. They were a paper tiger at that point. Paper tiger. They were only made that way because of the Nazis.